World powers are meeting in Geneva to try to put an end to the war in Syria. There are signs of progress, but what lies ahead on the road to peace? Hello, I'm Matthew Moore in Istanbul with the final part of TRT World's week-long special coverage of the Syrian conflict. Coming up in today's programme, the spirit of the revolution lives on as Syria's fragile ceasefire holds. People in Aleppo return to the streets to demand, once again, the fall of the regime. But can Syria remain united? That's the goal at the peace talks, but on the ground, the group has already declared autonomy. And making the best of a bad situation, the refugees making a living by turning this mountain of discarded life jackets into handbags, and they're selling fast. This is Syria, 5 years of conflict, the road to peace. An unprecedented cessation of hostilities in Syria has given people a break from the violence they've endured for 5 years. TRT World has pictures from Aleppo showing how people's lives have changed since the truce began in late February. Now, the regime controls the west, but the report we're about to show you was filmed in the east, where rebels have control. Here's Ali Mustafa.
Aleppo is alive with dissent. For years, demonstrations like this were silenced by regime barrel bombs. But people are no longer afraid since last month's cessation of hostilities.
Since the truce started, there have been no warplanes in the sky. That gave us the chance to protest, and we will not stop doing so.
Around the corner at this vegetable market, buyers and sellers are enjoying the calm.
I am against the talks. There has been bloodshed. People lost their relatives. People have gone missing. No one will accept the truce.
Children carry water from one neighborhood to the other, a contrast to life under the regime when essential services were stopped. A corner shop and the children enjoy an intense game of foosball. Many large businesses moved out of Aleppo after the 2011 uprising. Some set up shop 80 kilometers north across the border in Turkey. The former workers now sell goods on the streets like this vendor.
I bring some stuff from my home and sell it here. I also buy some glass, blankets, clothes and resell them.
This is the only road open to rebels in and out of Aleppo. All other routes are controlled by the regime, so the rebels stay vigilant despite the calm.
Pro-regime snipers, they oversee the roads, but thank God they aren't shooting much these days.
Tens of thousands of people have fled Aleppo in the past 5 years. The city remains devastated by the ravages of war. But those left behind remain resilient and continue with their revolution. Ali Mustafa, TRT World.
Well, the future of Syria is being debated by leaders 3,500 kilometres away in Geneva. The United Nations is mediating those talks. All the major powers involved are there: the United States, Russia and Iran. The Syrian regime also has a delegation led by Bashar Jafri, and the opposition is represented by the Saudi-based High Negotiations Committee. Now, John Brain is following the story for us, and he's just filed this report.
In a place often called the City of Peace, they're trying to end a war. And there's an optimism that they might just succeed.
I believe we will see a political solution in Syria very soon.
What we are talking about here is how to keep the unity of Syria.
The only plan B available is return to war.
After 5 years of conflict and failed diplomacy, the latest round of negotiations is gathering a momentum which has surpassed expectations. Delegates from the Syrian regime and the opposition aren't talking directly to each other, but they are talking. The two sides have been taking it in turns to meet UN negotiators. It's in stark contrast to last month's talks, which quickly collapsed.
So what's different this time?
Well, for a start, the cessation of hostilities has led to a rapid decline in the violence in Syria, and that's taken much of the acrimony and mistrust out of the discussions. But perhaps more significant is the surprise announcement by Russia that it's pulling out most of its forces from the country. That's being viewed here as a real game changer. Within hours of President Putin's announcement, Russian armed personnel were heading home. The message from Moscow to the Syrian regime was clear. We want you to negotiate for peace to avoid us being bogged down in a protracted and costly war. Experienced UN watchers say it's helped transform the dynamic at Geneva.
It's totally different. You really feel now the will of countries like the United States and Russia to be involved, being able to be around that table, pushing the different parties that are in the ground to find a solution.
The refugee crisis has added to the sense of urgency amongst the international community, as has the growth of Daesh and the worldwide threat it poses. So the pressure on the peace delegations has intensified, but there are still numerous obstacles to overcome.
Not all major groups are involved at the moment. For example, some of the armed groups that control a lot of territory are not involved. Not all the Syrians that are relevant from civil society are involved.
So a difficult road lies ahead, but it appears a real opportunity to end Syria's suffering could be opening up.
And John joins us live now from Geneva. John, earlier in the week we spoke to the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, and he said he believed this really was the best opportunity for peace in Syria. You've been talking to some of the delegates there. Do you get that sense too, John?
Yes, very much so. As I was saying in that report, the atmosphere has been completely transformed, both by the cessation of hostilities and by that Russian announcement that it's pulling out. And things are moving very rapidly now. The talks here will carry on just until next Thursday. There's no provision for an extension. The delegates will go away for 10 days. They'll then be back for a second round. The process will then be repeated with a third round, where they're actually hoping to draw up some sort of roadmap. So if everything goes well, you could be talking about a preliminary peace agreement before the summer. That, of course, is a big if, and much depends on that cessation of hostilities holding firm.
John Brain in Geneva, thank you. Well, let's have a look now at the groups who are left out of the talks. First, the PYD, which has just declared a federal system in parts of northern Syria. Also, the Al-Nusra Front, the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda, has been excluded. And, of course, Daesh, the group that controls almost 1/3 of Syria and areas in Iraq. The International Committee of the Red Cross is trying to work with all parties in the conflict, including the groups which are not represented at the peace talks. Earlier we spoke to Hugo Slim, the head of policy at the ICRC, about how prisoners might be used to broker peace.
We work with many armed groups all over the world, promoting international humanitarian law, asking them to think about the Geneva Conventions and abide by them. And we would certainly reach out to any armed group, regardless of their ideology, to try and work with them on this problem. The Geneva Conventions are one area of international law, international norms that speak about compassion in war and humanitarian considerations in war. But there are many others, and in Islam, Sharia law as well is very determined and articulate on the fact that there should be limits to violence in war and that wounded people should be treated compassionately. Prisoners, detainees, are often used as part of confidence-building measures. One side makes a move to prove that it's acting with integrity, and often prisoners are the instruments with which confidence is built. It's very important that the primary principle for dealing with prisoners and detainees is humanity. And we have to think about those individual prisoners, their rights under international humanitarian law and applicable human rights law, and their needs to get home to their families as soon as possible.
I'm joined now by Joshua Landis, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He's also the founder of Syria Comment, a news site that follows developments in the country. Mr. Landis, thank you very much for joining us on TRT World. A little earlier we were talking about the groups that have been excluded from the peace talks in Geneva. One of those groups is Daesh, of course. Now, if they're not being engaged diplomatically, they have to be removed militarily. Do you think that's possible?
Well, it's not clear how that's going to be done. One needs a partner on the ground in order to replace them and to provide a better government than they can. And that the United States does not have a partner. They've been using the Kurds, but the Kurds have taken as much territory as they possibly can. And now they're facing just Arab territory. So unless the United States gets an Arab partner, this will be impossible. Of course, Russia has tried to suggest Assad as that partner, but the United States has rejected that option.
We've seen the most powerful air forces in the world pounding them for months, and yet it seems to have been ineffective, or at least not conclusive. Why do you think that is?
Well, because there's nobody to replace them. And even though they're quite weak, it's not, people can't provide an internal resistance against ISIS unless there's somebody there to replace them. And ISIS has been very brutal about suppressing any potential opposition groups, whether it's amongst tribal leaders or political parties.
I just want to take you through the areas that are controlled by the various groups. Let's take a look at that. This is what Syria looks like today. The areas in red are controlled by the regime, and in green, we're just going to get this map up here now, and in green are the various opposition groups who rose up against Assad. The black areas there under Daesh control, and the yellow parts in the north of the country are now controlled by the PYD's armed group, the YPG, the Syrian branch of the PKK terror group that's fighting the Turkish state. I want to just ask you about the chances for Syria of emerging from this war as one country. As I said, we've seen the PYD saying that we are going to have our own area, we're going to administer our own area in northern parts of Syria. What are the chances that Syria will emerge as one country? Do you rate them highly?
You know, that's the million-dollar question. It seemed possible when Russia was really backing the Assad regime. That was the claim of the Assad regime, that it would be able to reconquer, even if it took 2, 3, 4 years, that it would eventually reconquer Syria. And there seemed to be some small prospect for that because there is very little support for the rebels. And should Assad be able to close off the Turkish border, for example, and begin to starve rebel centers, it would be hard for the rebels to sustain this. Today, that looks less likely. With Russia claiming that it's withdrawing from Syria, it's unclear whether the Assad regime can really take back all of Syria. They are going to be the Idlib area, that green area that you're showing on the map, the Idlib province next to Turkey, which is rebel central in the north, is going to have a hard time holding out against the regime should the Assad forces be able to close the border between Turkey and the rebels so that they can't get resupplies, can't get new arms, can't get food and money in. That's going to be the big challenge.
Joshua Landis from the University of Oklahoma, thank you very much for your analysis. Well, what about Syria's neighbouring countries who've been affected by the conflict and the refugee crisis? Zena Awad asked some residents of Beirut what they think the future holds for Lebanon.
Lebanon has been called a barometer for the Middle East. Regional and international influences have regularly washed up its shores. And in the current climate, the Sunni-Shia divide has become pronounced with the war in neighboring Syria. We've come to Beirut to test the waters and hear what people think.
As long as we have this kind of religious thinking that's been around for 1400 years, then it will be difficult to undo it. Even if calm returns to Syria, it's difficult to see how we can get calm in Lebanon. You need to shake up the Arab people. People are affected by religion, and religion is bringing us problems.
If they solve Syria, then that will definitely have a positive impact on Lebanon because we will be relieved from the problem of refugees and from the extremism that's grown. We've always had differences between parties, but not in such an extreme way.
And this divide was recently brought home when both the GCC and the Arab League declared Hezbollah, which is an armed Shia group and a political party, to be a terrorist organization. We've heard a lot of criticism of that decision, even from those who don't necessarily support Hezbollah.
How can we as Lebanese be sympathetic with these Arab countries because we have a lot of interest with them, and at the same time say that a large part of our parliament is part of a terrorist group? This is a problem for us.
People are looking to see how the talks in Geneva go. They're hoping they will go well, and it will be plain sailing for this country's future.
Now, since Syria's war broke out, 4.8 million people have become refugees. Almost 500,000 Syrians fled to Europe last year. Most of them reached European soil on the Greek island of Lesbos. Now, after arriving in rubber dinghies, their life jackets are discarded. And now there are concerns that not only a refugee crisis is developing, but an ecological one too. Sally Ihan reports.
It helped them get here, but only just. Risk for most Syrians is a fickle thing.
Syria is the most beautiful country in the world. The destruction has been committed by the Assad regime and the opposition. I lost 3 children in the war, 3 young men.
With 1 child left, Hind was desperate to find somewhere safe. She founded at PIPCA, an organisation that supports the most vulnerable refugees. To raise money, they run upcycling workshops, making bags out of the countless life jackets left behind. Taylor Shuhab has found purpose and pride.
I was doing some work. I was happy for this work.
He makes 2 to 3 bags a day and can earn around €200 a week, more than some Greeks on the island.
A material loaded with all these hopes and the idea of passage, just to let it be treated like a piece of plastic, did not make any sense.
Some bags are donated to refugees moving on, and those that are sold help people who stay behind.
The scale of the problem is huge. More than 80,000 cubic metres of plastics from discarded life jackets and boats were left over in 2015 alone. And when it's all over, this is likely to remain and could bring an ongoing ecological disaster to the island.
As the local council struggles with the growing build-up, a load is being lifted elsewhere.
The beautiful thing about them is we don't feel like we are strangers. We feel like we are friends here. When they see me staying alone, they tell me, please don't be sad. We are your sons. We will find your sons.
As Hind benefits from the island waste, she's also building bonds to cope with others she's lost. Sally Ihan, TRT World, Lesbos.
Now, the vast majority of Syrian refugees are trying to make their way to Germany. 430,000 Syrians registered for asylum in the country last year. Dominic Velitas has spoken to 2 of those refugees who are beginning a new life in Berlin.
Mein Name ist Firas Al-Shatil. Ich wohne hier in Berlin seit 2,5 Jahren und ich komme aus Syrien.
He's the hipster YouTuber whose online videos are viewed by millions. Like many Syrians, Firas Al-Shatil came to Germany to escape the war. His light-hearted films try to bridge the gap between refugees and Germans.
I left everything in my country. I left my home, my friends, my family. I left everything and I come here, I start from zero. I'm doing I'm doing video, I'm working, I have this company here and I have my study. If I have my freedom and I have everything what I have it here, so I have no problem to back to Syria.
Like Firas, Hiba al-Basir didn't want to come to Germany. Syria was her home. But after violence spiraled out of control, she had no choice but to relocate to Berlin. She now runs a furniture store in the city.
It was very hard, actually, for us to leave Syria. We must go back. It's not so good to stay here and say, okay, we have our life here and we don't go back. when it's peace and it's really time to go out, to go back, we will go back. Actually, yes.
They are very different stories, but they share some striking similarities. Both Firas and Hiba have suffered greatly as a result of Syria's civil war, and both are doubtful that peace will ever be returned to their home country. That said, both have integrated well into German society and have made a success of their lives here. Dominic Velitis, TRT World, Berlin.
Well, we heard in that report 2 refugees doing well in Germany, but keen to get back to Syria. But can their country be successfully rebuilt? The former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt has written an essay on the lessons he learned from rebuilding a failed state, and he says they can be applied to Syria. And Bildt says, before anything, it's essential to establish a secure environment. A focus on state building should be a priority. Knowing exactly what kind of state will be built is key. And he says that starts with an agreement on a constitutional framework. Preconditions for long-term economic growth, like a currency and banking system, should then be considered, as well as nurturing a positive regional environment. International support is needed to ease the process. And finally, Bildt notes that all factions should be aware that nation building takes time and resources. TRT World's editor-at-large Craig Capitas joins us now from Paris. Craig, quite a long list, certainly a good list, if you like, of institutions and so on that need to be rebuilt. But are the lessons practical and applicable to Syria?
Well, Bildt is one of the wise men, but I think his recipe contains way too many hobgoblins. Remember, diplomats for the past 5 years have been dealing with this. And on the side, what they do is they give journalists off the record their observations. And the journalists print them, and the diplomats read them in the newspaper, and then they believe them. There are so many big issues here, Matthew, as our series this week has shown out, but the two that stand out most of all is, what's the West going to do with Assad? He's not going anywhere. Is he going to magically become Assad 2.0, go over this cosmetic change and become a Democrat? And let's assume that he does, or he can sell that. Well, are all those refugees going to trust him and return to the country? Then how much is it going to cost? I can guarantee you right now people are talking about whether it would be more cost-effective to keep the refugees in Greece, allow Greece to default on its billions and billions of dollars of owed money, and turn the country into a de facto state for Syrian refugees. It could be cheaper that way. The United States is no longer in the business of nation building, and neither is the EU. It's too expensive.
Craig Capitas in Paris, thank you very much for your analysis. Now, around half of all registered Syrian refugees are children, and they often have very little to look forward to. But the Olympic Federation is trying to change that, helping them through sport. And it's not just for kids. Lance Santos has the story.
Their futures are unclear. Trapped inside barbed wire fences for years on end would make even the most hardened soul depressed. But somehow, some way, the children of Kilis refugee camp still smile. It's that hope the Turkish Taekwondo Federation is using to inspire its refugee project. On Turkey's border with Syria, you'll find Okupina Accommodation Center, which houses 25,000 refugees. The World Taekwondo Federation, known as the WTF, is expanding its humanitarian foundation to bring hope and joy to the people of Kilis. The head of the WTF visited the camp and handed out brand new kits and put on a coaching clinic for the youngsters. For a lot of the children here, this is the first time they'd been given anything new, let alone brand new sports gear.
During the days after school, they don't have nothing to do. So I'm very happy to give them, through our Olympic sport of Taekwondo, give them a hope and dream.
And it's not just in Kilis where sport is changing the lives of those who have lost everything.
The IOC today has officially launched this team of refugee Olympic athletes.
From Syria to Sudan, Congo to Iran, they may be refugees, but they are still athletes. And now, the IOC has given them a team. Mehdi Rastboud is one of them.
I had to go out of Iran. First of all, it was so difficult for me. All of the refugees, they have a difficult times. They have a hope. All of my life was dark, but now the clouds, they gone and the sun rise.
The announcement of a refugee team may not stop the suffering of millions, nor will it ease the pain of those who have lost so much. But it has changed the lives of a handful of people, and sport has given a young generation of refugees a little hope and something to look forward to in life. Lance Santos, TRT World.
Well, that concludes our week-long special coverage of Syria's 5 years of conflict. We've examined the state of besieged Syria today and how a peaceful revolution became a global proxy war, which has sparked Europe's biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. We leave you now with some of the most striking pictures of the conflict. Thanks for watching.